It's sometimes forgotten that Cyberpunk was originally a tabletop role-playing game. It came out in 1988, in that post-Neuromancer era, when the genre was really starting to take off. And while CD Projekt Red would give Cyberpunk a massive publicity wave with their 2020 video game as well as the 2022 anime, Cyberpunk has actually spent most of its history overshadowed by a much larger tabletop game. In the same genre, Shadowrun would launch 1 year after Cyberpunk. It was Cyberpunk, but with magic and elves. It's a world where magicians stand shoulder to shoulder with deckers and street samurai, with all of you fighting for your own desperate little slice of the pie, running between the shadows of corporate Seattle. Shadowrun is set in the Sixth World, the world that comes right after ours. We've got some Mayan calendar shenanigans going on here, except that the end of the long count in 2012 didn't signal an end to the world. It signaled an awakening of a new era of magic and technology.
Hey, I know you. You don't remember me, do you? I'm William. William System Reboot Deckard. Today we're talking about one of tabletop role-playing's most long-running series. And like most other things we've discussed on this channel, it has a long and complicated history. But also, a lot of spin-offs. Shadowrun is a game that people turn to for the fantasy it offers as well as the world it has built. But they don't usually turn to the game for its gameplay. I don't necessarily want to weigh in on that, but Shadowrun is one of those systems where no matter what edition they're on, the majority of people are, at best, fine with the rules. Though of course, as you get more and more recent, the reviews go down. Nevertheless, Shadowrun is an incredibly important piece of tabletop gaming history, and it says a lot that the game has survived so long, even with, a rather poor reputation for its mechanics. So I say it's time we crack open Shadowrun and take a look at what's inside. So let's start with an old SNES classic, and let's check out the world of cloak and dagger politics of corporate Seattle. It's September, which means it's time to start getting prepared for spooky season at your tables. And one of the best angles to accomplish this is using dark fantasy. Grim Hollow is a tabletop role-playing setting where the gods are dead and shadow strangles the world. One of the dark stars of this particular setting is the transformation system. Your players might find their flesh twisting into a dozen different supernatural forms, each including a fully realized system of changing over time. Inside Grim Hollow, you'll also find dozens of new 5th edition compatible subclasses that reimagine the base D&D classes as archetypes in a world without hope, such as the Paladins of the Oath of Slaughter, plus an entirely original new base class built for a broken world like this, the Monster Hunter. Longtime viewers will recognize that Grim Hollow is created by Ghostfire Gaming, who brought us a familiar city of the damned called Drakenheim. Well, the Kings of Dark Fantasy role-playing are back with Grim Hollow 2nd Edition, where they're revamping, refining, and expanding the setting. They've got a Kickstarter coming on October 1st, but you know what? I'm gonna tell you more about that in October. Instead, right now, I just want to help you get the playtest materials in your hands today. If you pre-pledge $1 to the campaign using the link below, you'll gain access to their Discord. And in there, you're going to find all of the current playtest materials. And this pre-pledge gets you a free set of Grim Hollow dice if you later pledge to any physical tier. A big thanks to Ghostfire and to Grim Hollow. Now, let's return to a world that is similarly bad to live in, but for entirely different reasons. Let's talk about the chain of events that led to the creation of a fantasy cyberpunk world before we get into the lore of the modern day. Since I'm quite sure most of you are wondering, why are there orcs? Why are there elves? How'd this happen? Urban fantasy is an interesting and somewhat common at this point genre, but the conversion of the actual real world into a full-on fantasy setting is an altogether different premise. And oftentimes it ends up really weird, usually in one of two ways. For the first way these things tend to go, one need look no farther than the Netflix film Bright.
Fairy lives don't matter today.
Bright essentially adds fantasy elements to modern America, but then just kind of goes, yes, there was a Dark Lord a few thousand years ago, but otherwise history went exactly the same. Even though there's like elves and orcs running around now, it's not great world building, and it honestly just didn't take advantage of the unique stuff that could have been done. And worse, it ended up just failing to have any fun with the idea of American magic. But you could go the other way too. X-Crawl is a minor TTRPG franchise by Goodman Games. You play as adventurers in the Empire of America, a world in which adventurers are more like wrestlers who battle monsters and evade obstacles, while dressed in branded jerseys, in front of a roaring crowd, of course. See, in this one we go far off the other direction. The Empire of America is just a USA-themed fantasy world. It's not fantasy that's like blended with our reality at all. Shadowrun bridges this gap. The world was as we know it, but the timeline splits in the 90s. In our world, the laissez-faire, pro-corporate politics of the 80s, spearheaded by Reagan and Thatcher, established the precedent of corporation and government getting in bed together. These policies continued on into the 90s and 2000s, until now it kind of just feels like it's always been like that. But it actually, believe it or not, it could be worse, because in Shadowrun they didn't just maintain these policies into the 90s, they ramped them up even further. It started in New York in 1999. A strike by the Teamsters Union brought the city to its knees. Rather than giving the workers what they wanted at the expense of the shareholders getting marginally fewer billions, the corps instead sent in hired thugs to break the strike, as though it was the 1800s. When this was eventually brought to court, the government stepped in and they flat out passed a law that allowed corporations to just maintain their own private militaries. As the years went on, America reduced its military budget substantially, allowing corporations to fight conflicts on their behalf. Tripling down on the partnership with the big corps, America began once more enforcing eminent domain on a mass scale, seizing up large plots of land and selling them to private businesses for profit. They quickly found an easy target: Native American reservations. Lands were seized, communities broken up by jackbooted thugs working at the behest of billionaires. Both Mexico and Canada quickly followed America's lead, and soon the last remaining thread of indigenous legacy was severed. After years of having their homes seized and their families torn apart to benefit the rich, a band of Native Americans struck back in 2009, seizing a nuclear weapons site. They demanded their land back, and when a government kill team was sent instead, a nuke was launched at Russia to spark Armageddon. One of the great mysteries of Shadowrun is exactly what happened to that nuke. It never hit Russia, and no one really knows why. The reaction was swift. Every man, woman, and child of Native American descent or with ties to indigenous bands were rounded up and placed in internment camps to be re-educated. Parallel to all of this, a lot is happening. An earthquake in New York breaks the city, killing 250,000 and damaging infrastructure so much that much of the population is forced to move elsewhere. North Korea launches a nuke at Japan. It's not a good nuke, it fails to explode, but as a result, Japan throws off all of its old treaties of disarmament. And then, a global pandemic called Vitas sweeps over the population, spontaneously infecting its victims with lethal allergies. 1/4 of the world would soon be dead from Vitas 1. And as you can tell by the fact that it has a number, this was only the first wave. In 2011, as the world was in the throes of the worst pandemic since the plague, the first children are born with unexplained genetic expression. The hospitals were too clogged with Vitas patients to really dig into what was happening, but it became obvious pretty quickly. Parents were somehow giving birth to elven and dwarven babies. which, honestly, I can see how they'd recognize that a baby is an elf, because, I mean, they got the pointed ears, right? But how did they know that these slightly wide babies were dwarves? Were they born with beards and hairy bodybuilding physiques?
Rock and stone!
And on December 24th, the floodgates open. Dragons appear, one in Japan, the other in Wales. An indigenous man named Daniel Coleman gathers up his people from an internment camp, and they simply walk out. The guards attempt to fire into the crowd, but a wall of magical energy protects them. All across the world, dragons and other mythological creatures wake up, wreaking chaos. The German armed forces strike back, becoming the first dragon slayers of the Sixth World. Elves and dwarves become classified as metahumans, and discrimination begins against the strange babies. The Pope declares them all abominations. Daniel Coleman, now taking the name Howling Coyote, launches a guerrilla warfare campaign against the United States, freeing the internment camps. The Native Americans soon discover that their traditional practices have a direct connection to magic. Now, I know what you're thinking. I mean, they've clearly got no actual shot at beating the United States Army, right? Well, not so, because unlike the colonial era, this time it's the Americans who find themselves without the weapons of modern war. Magic is easily stronger than the technology of 2014. Maybe the USA would have had a fair chance at the height of their power, but 25% of America had just died to Vitas, and their biggest and most prosperous city had just been reduced to rubble. Indigenous populations rise up in Canada as well, joining the war against their oppressors. Down in Mexico, their native peoples win a more peaceful seizure of power. Inspired by their northern brethren, a powerful political party emerges called Azatlan. They dominate the election and begin to push Mexico away from their Spanish colonial culture in favor of a new Mesoamerican renaissance. The country is soon renamed Aztlan, and it allies itself with the rebels up north. But the war rages on. Howling Coyote's demands are severe. Everyone not born of Native American descent leaves North America forever. To prove he means business, he used his magic to detonate a volcano in New Mexico. The USA and Canada are clearly losing this war, but there's also just straight up no way they can accept those demands and surrender. President William Jarman demands the opposite, an eviction of all Native Americans from the continent. It was very much a no you, and it was clearly not gonna work. The war continues, and it's devastating for both sides. In what could be considered an act of mercy, Daniel's forces launch a knockout blow. Daniel spreads word to all the bands across North America. A great ghost dance is performed in unison by thousands, channeling the New World magic. What happened next is left a bit up for interpretation. It may have been the goal, or it may simply have been a side effect of the dance. All across the continent, more volcanoes detonate, coating the Western Hemisphere with ash and killing thousands. This finally forced the government to the table. A great meeting was called in Denver, where the USA and Canada agreed to a partial surrender. The western half of the continent would be ceded to the NAN, the Native American nations, excepting Western California and the city of Seattle. Over a 10-year period, everyone of European, African, and Asian heritage would be resettled out east, which was actually, surprisingly, vaguely doable, considering how many homes and jobs were left unoccupied after the Vitas outbreak. The USA was allowed to set up Anglo reservations for people who refused to resettle, as well as bases and infrastructure to sustain them and the western cities. Now this was far short of the NAN war goals. The lore is inconsistent as to exactly why they agreed to this, considering that they were winning so handily. The writing vaguely dances around the fact that they were unable to enforce their demands, and they were worried about, continuing the war. But honestly, when you actually read the play-by-play in the timeline, it sure doesn't seem like that was the case. I suspect that the NAN settled for this peace as something of an act of mercy. See, let's be clear, Daniel's uprising was absolutely justified. His war aims, though? those significantly less justified. Dude was calling for an ethnic cleansing campaign to rival the greatest crimes of the 20th century. We're talking nearly 300 million people removed from their homes and sent to live in refugee camps the size of entire countries somewhere across the ocean. But it was quickly becoming clear that the expulsion of that many human beings was literally not something that could be done, or that the victims of it would ever agree to. Any attempt to actually enforce Howling Coyote's dream of a North American with only Native Americans in it was inevitably going to become a war of extermination, which is a far cry from the war of displacement that they set out to fight. I suspect they signed the Denver Agreement once they realized that they'd have to do the world's largest recorded genocide in order to make their goals real. And it doesn't seem like there was actually an appetite for that among their coalition. And so, the NAN were established, a union that included the artist formerly known as Mexico. Nevertheless, the evacuation didn't end up getting the chance to utilize the full 10 years that they signed for in the agreement. After about 2 of those years, the Anglos started suffering discrimination and armed violence against them from the new Western countries. Refugees and settlers from the ceded territory began flooding into the USA's remaining western lands. Seattle becomes a megacity that the Salish nation quickly has to wall off to prevent sprawling beyond its treaty bounds. Japanese corporations begin setting up offices in the city, using it as the main port of call to access both the USA and the surrounding NAN markets. And then, in 2021, we hit the most what the fuck part of the timeline. 10% of the Earth's population experiences, and I quote, Goblinization, which is kind of just when people melt and become orcs and trolls. No, they don't become goblins. I don't know why they called it that. The King of England becomes an orc, and his royal guards just straight up murder him because that's messed up. Our king isn't supposed to be an orc. This is a proper country, innit? The elves and dwarves are still children at this point, but they've experienced tons of school discrimination and bullying. But now, with 10% of the world becoming orcs and trolls, there are now adult metahumans to suffer the full brunt of racism. It ramps up heavily from here. People exile or even just murder their goblinized family members. Segregation laws get signed, and corporations treat metahumans like property to be experimented on. In Seattle, goblinization is assumed to be infectious, so all metahumans are locked up by the governor until proof comes out a full year later that it's not actually a disease. Humans attempt to become even more racist about all of this, but they're thwarted by a new strain of Vitas that forces them all back into quarantine. Nevertheless, another 10% of humanity dies to spontaneous allergic reactions. By the way, do you guys want to take a population tally? I want to take a population tally. This is the population of the USA in 2010 in our timeline, which is where I would assume that most immigration stops in Shadowrun, cause why would anyone want to move to an active war zone that's also got the plague? And since the population of the USA absolutely does not grow without immigration, let's just freeze the number where it is and start knocking it down as things go wrong. 309.3 million Americans. Let's round that down to just 309, because New York got trashed a few years before and they lost around 250,000. And with so many people displaced, a lot of the survivors probably moved out of the country. Then, in 2010, we get Vitas 1. That's 25% of the population gone. 231 million remain. It's rough. Okay, next one. Indigenous Americans secede. That's 5.2 million people, but we'll assume that they got hit with Vitas at a similar rate. 3.9 million Americans are no longer part of the USA. 227 million card-carrying Americans are left. Then there's the wars. It's hard to estimate deaths. Seems like the rebels mostly fought the corporations, and they didn't end up killing too many civilians in the conflict. But those volcanoes they fired off certainly did. Let's knock off a clean 4 million from the conflict. People are dead from the volcanoes, from the war, and a ton of people probably fled North America in accordance to the NAN's threats. Peace treaty is signed and a refugee crisis occurs. Many starve or get murdered before they can relocate. A bunch are forced to abandon their homes and they might just move to more stable countries instead. Let's knock off a full 2 million more through all this process. 221 million. 10% of that gets goblinized. A lot of those people die during the goblinization process, and the ones who finish transforming are no longer considered citizens. Which means that the human population is now 198.9 million. Next, we get hit with another round of VTOS, taking out another 10% of the American population. We've gone from 309 million to 179 mil in less than 10 years. And many of those also aren't human. I have no way of calculating how many elves and dwarves were born, but you can be assured that the law does not see them as humans or citizens of the USA. Anyway, I just thought it was important to keep you guys up to speed on the population situation, lest I not make it clear how cataclysmically bad the awakening has been for the USA. But okay, not everything is all bad. The Az Technology Corporation builds a pyramid in Seattle, and that's nifty. It's here that the situation starts to stabilize and resemble the world of Shadowrun as we know it in 2050 when the tabletop picks up. Metahuman suffrage has become a big topic of politics, and various US states battle it out to decide if their non-humans count as citizens. The government, meanwhile, has lost all ability to enforce pretty much anything, and private business now runs the show. And the internet starts becoming much, much more in this period. In 2024, the US election does away with physical votes entirely, doing a completely internet-based election. Bionics start to take off and cause controversies in sporting events. Universities start offering magic and occultism courses. You see, since the Great Ghost Dance, magic has been trickling back to all cultures, not just the ones who had ties to their ancient traditions. This actually might have been the intention of the Great Ghost Dance. Once again, it's left unclear. Plus, many NAN nations have softened a little bit on this whole ethno-state thing they were trying out, and they realize that it's hard to have nation-states that only contain a few 100,000 citizens each. They allow metahumans of all ancestries to settle within their territory. And then the internet, more often called the Matrix these days, is overcome by a virus of a global scale. The world economy borders on freefall as the virus just seems to be attacking and sabotaging technology at random. They would come to call it the Crash. An elite team is put together to go physically inside the Matrix. See, our good 1980s writers who gave us this setting knew for sure how computers work. Absolutely they did.
You've got mail.
So, you know how you've got your icons and then you click on those icons? Well, as computers were getting more and more complicated, there were just so many icons to click on. Just too many. How can anyone even remember what every icon means? Rather than invent the field of UX design as we did in our world in answer to that problem, the world of Shadowrun instead created the Cyber Terminal, devices to let hackers and programmers physically enter the Matrix so that they didn't have to click on all those icons. Although many died to fight the virus in its home turf, an arms race began as corporations realized that their tech actually wasn't good enough to keep hackers armed with cyber terminals out. Deckers, as they came to be called, were soon mandatory for corps to have on staff in order to design security systems and fight off other Deckers inside the Matrix. The crash did irreparable damage to many nations around the world. Canada especially has been hit hard, having lost their entire west without even getting treaty cities like Seattle. It's a bit of a rump state at this point that only controls the metropolitan area of Ontario. Oh, did I mention they lost Quebec? They seem to have lost Quebec actually before the NAN wars. It's surprising that the NAN didn't try and take any Quebec territory. The French just got to keep it all. In 2030, Canada and America agree to a union of their badly beaten up nations. No more Canada and no more USA. The UCAS, the United Canadian American States, is born. America, for the first time in decades, is on the rise. And then, in 2034, the South secedes. Why? I don't know why. It doesn't appear to be explained anywhere. The South just does that sometimes, don't worry about it. Thankfully, this time around, a civil war is avoided. And the UCAS agrees to an amicable split. Following the success of the new Dixie state, a wave of separatism sweeps the continent. A clan of elves, the oldest of which are finally in their mid-20s, declare an independent elven nation, carved out of sparsely populated NAN territory in Oregon. Aztalan leaves the NAN as well, being easily the most powerful and prosperous member of it. They'd rather just have their full independence. Howling Coyote steps down, rather than leading a war against the separatists. You know, that last war, it got a bit out of control, so he's not really game for another one. California is next, being so heavily cut off from the rest of the nation. Their freedom doesn't come unopposed though, and they're set upon by all sides. Aztlans in the south, elves to the north, and UCAS troops preparing to quash the rebellion. With its north and south occupied by invaders, California sells out to the Japanese Empire, granting them a treaty port in San Francisco in exchange for protection. And from here, North America is basically solidified. Revolts and discrimination would eventually lead to metahumans achieving equal rights, but they're still subject to a lot of racism in 2050 when the first edition of Shadowrun is set. The corporations have taken over everything. Seattle is the default setting for Shadowrun, where companies vie for dominance in towering mega complexes that blot out the sun. And you, all of you, the players, are those who make a dangerous living, running in the shadows between. Now, we've had some time to marinate in why Shadowrun is the way it is, but now we've got a video game to cover, and we can use it to explore what Shadowrun looks like in 2050. Shadowrun on the SNES was the first of an incidental trilogy. 3 Shadowrun games were made in the 90s. Each was released on a different platform, which is as frustrating as it is funny. In this SNES classic, we're going to play as courier Jake Armitage, after he's received the New Vegas welcome.
Truth is, the game was rigged from the start.
Hi, I'm William SRD. I cover video games related to tabletop franchises. I cover D&D games, World of Darkness, Warhammer, and now I've also dipped my toe into Shadowrun. As always, anytime I open up a new franchise, YouTube tends to fight me on it. With that in mind, if you want to see me continue to cover the other Shadowrun games, the best way to make certain I can continue on with that in the near future is by liking the video and dropping a comment. What's your favorite work of cyberpunk fiction? Do you have any hot takes about the genre? Here's mine. Yu-Gi-Oh! Counts as cyberpunk. If you liked last month's video about D&D's greatest fan setting, consider heading over to my Patreon. I've got a monthly podcast I do up there. This month, my co-host and I brought on a few of the developers of Anbanar for a chat. So, if you'd like to access that, as well as gain sneak peeks on upcoming videos and even early releases, then head on over there and sign up to support the channel. Jake Armitage wakes up in a morgue. This game may be an early RPG, but don't be fooled. There's an incredible amount of point-and-click adventure DNA mixed in there as well, and a fairly linear one at that. So I start checking everything. We find our name, Jake Armitage of course, and we also find a scalpel, which will be important for a random objective hours from now. It's that sort of game. While I attempt to start things off calmly and carefully, the morgue workers are a lot less deliberate than I am. They take one look at Jake and they use their combined medical knowledge to diagnose him with zombie. They lock themselves in a closet, and there's really no point asking them for a second opinion. Outside the building, a thug says hi. He saw the whole thing. We got gunned down by some hired thugs, though he hasn't got a clue why. And that little section in the morgue is the closest the game will ever come to telling us what needs to be done. From here, we've got an entire Seattle to wander. Hitting the streets and talking to various passerby, we run into a major mechanic. This is one of those games where we have to build a vocabulary. We can talk to people and they'll explain different concepts to us, which will then be added to our vocab list as things we can ask other NPCs about. And soon we have a basic list of words we know. Words like hitman, decker, shadowrunner, hire, gun.
スーパーハイパーウルトラアルティメットデラックスパーフェクトアメージングストロングキュートビューティフルギャラクシーベイビー
Pretty quickly it becomes apparent that news of Jake's survival has gotten out. No matter where we go, there are people trying to gun us down from the windows. We can make the educated guess that there must be a bounty on us specifically, since nobody else on the street is getting shot at. It's not normal street violence, although we do come across some of that as well. Wandering down the wrong alley, we find an orc that's just killed a guy. We're able to pick up the victim's gun, and now we're finally in a position to fire back at all of our would-be assassins. Down the back of the alley, we find a perplexing visitor. This freaky cult dog that says we must obey its master. This creature is actively terrifying. Well done, art team. Wandering about, we find a little bit about ourselves. We were a Shadowrunner, though how good of one, we can't really tell. The dead body of a guy associated with us signals that this was a pretty thorough assassination. But in good news, our dead acquaintance does have a key to our apartment, so we can at last put our feet up safely. Jake's got about 20 new yen stored, a pair of sunglasses, and a phone number from someone named Sassy, who might be Jake's girlfriend. Apparently we need to find a cred stick to actually work the phone, so there's not going to be any reunions in our near future. However, even without a cred stick, we can check the answering machine. And we have a message. A guy named Drake politely wanted us to know that there would be consequences if we went through with the courier job. Elsewhere in the city, we find out that there's an exclusive club that needs a ticket to enter. Short on things to try, I start pursuing a ticket. In a bar, we find a guy who was offered a ticket by this dude named Grinder. Unfortunately, Grinder ended up getting taken out by law enforcement recently. The tickets might still be on the body. I buy myself a counterfeit sheriff's badge and I head to the morgue, naturally putting on my sunglasses first so that they don't think I'm that zombie they met earlier. We find the tickets in the filing cabinet, as well as our old cred stick while we're there. We call Sassy, but instead of being glad we're alive, Sassy seems to have dropped us without a second thought. Still, she tells us that our employer was a guy named Glutman, and she gives us his number. His secretary says that Glutman is off at the club that we just got a ticket for, so it's time to head on over and see if we can get some answers. Answers like, "Who's this man Sassy is dancing with?" She pretends not to know us though, and we're in way too much shit right now to cause a scene. Glutman is short on answers for us, but he does seem to be genuinely glad that Jake is okay. Hoping to help protect a runner who did good work, Glutman has his team smuggle us past all the hitmen to a safe place he knows about. And look, Glutman is our friend, but I didn't say he was a good friend. So this safe place he's gotten for us is the most budget option available. There's a big orc named the King who rules over a junkyard. He takes payments from the outside to take runaways into his scrap kingdom. We're safe from all the hired killers, but now we're trapped in here, and the king will not be letting us out without a substantial bribe. And that's money that we just don't have. But it is money that we could earn in the king's arena. You see, that's the other half of the king's grift here. Making all of his scions here battle it out for a large crowd for money. We have to do a lot of grinding to make it through this section, over and over fighting thugs on the edges of the car yard. But eventually we've gained enough experience points that I can level up my combat skills enough to fight my way through the arena. Now, the combat in this game is worth a little bit of coverage right here. It's overall pretty passive and tanky. You shoot at them while they shoot at you. Whoever has the best gear and combat stats is going to win. But some fights have a little bit more to them than that. You have to move the crosshair cursor over your enemy to shoot them, and it will lock on, so it's actually not a huge pain when the enemies move around. Except that some enemies are extra agile, and they're capable of breaking your lock on. forcing you to have to chase them around with the reticule. And there's some real tough enemies down here in the pit, so not only is it a challenge to actually stay locked onto them, but they've also just got better guns and stats than us. So it's actually quite a bit of grinding to progress past the car yards. And even once our stats are up to snuff, we need, William to be good enough with the reticule to keep the enemy in Jake's sights. We make it pretty far, but there's some enemies that we're just not gonna beat at this stage of the game. We can come back here later though. They'll still pay us out for clearing the full arena if we come back with better stats and better gear. For now though, we're strong enough that we can ask to fight the king himself in the arena, and he can't turn us down without looking weak. The king is actually nowhere near as tough as some of the enemies we've fought so far in the arena. And just like that, we're free, and we got to keep all of our prize money, which I used to buy a shotgun, because I'm not going one more step in this game without having a better gun than a pistol. My God. This is a new district of the city we're in, and we're now able to access a street dock. Our cyber deck has been broken ever since we got, New Vegas at the start of the game, so having somebody patch that up for us, that'd be sick. The good news, the dock actually does manage to get it working for us. The bad news, he trips the anti-tampering device that whatever the hell we're carrying in our head had. Yeah, that's right, the package we were delivering, it's in our brain. And now our brain is a cortex bomb. We have hours left to live. You know what? I don't care what the culture is, I don't care about the custom, I'm not tipping this fucking dock. Now this guy here, this is a back alley street dock, and I guess I got what I paid for. But at least he's polite enough to recommend us to a fancy dock downtown who can unfuck the situation. We take public transit to get there, which I guess good on the cyberpunk dystopia for having a good public transit system. It's both free and extremely on time. We shoot our way out of the downtown station after being ambushed, after which we're greeted by another encounter with a dog acolyte. We're told to come and seek the dog before it's too late. Sure, no problem. I just need the bomb out of my head first. Resistance is much stiffer in this part of town. Dozens of guns firing at us from all over until we crash our way into Maplethorpe's office. Fortunately, this doctor is actually competent and he stops the bomb. After we're done, we loop back downtown for a battle with the gang that ambushed us outside the substation. In their base, we find evidence that they were hired by Drake, and they have a code to access his building. We're still a long way from ready to directly attack corporate HQ though, so let's carry on with the investigation. We had to go to a downtown club, spot a dancing fox girl on the other side of a wall, and then somehow know to click on her to make her teleport to us. I don't know how in dog's name anyone is supposed to know to do that. This is the only NPC that can do that. You can't talk to any of the other ones through walls. You're just supposed to psychically know that you can talk to this one. Anyway, Kitsune, as she calls herself, tells us that she was hired by Dog to save us at the start of the game. She's why we survived a bullet to the cranium. After our chat, we head down to the docks and finally find Dog. What the hell is this? The dog acolytes were so ominous, and then suddenly they hit us with this all dogs go to heaven sprite. What a waste of a good build-up. Dog demands that we prove our devotion by killing the shaman of a rival spirit, the rat. I pick up Kitsune from the bar to join me on this one, and the two of us head over to kill the rat shaman. It's a tough fight, and Kitsune is forced to retreat from my party before we even reach the boss. In fairness, I hadn't figured out the companion system by then. I didn't know I could make her use healing spells, so that was my bad. She's not dead though, she's just retreated. After killing the rat shaman, it's revealed why Dog wanted this dude dead. He was puppeteered not by the rat spirit, but instead by a strange dark jester, who haunts us as we retreat. So, Dog, what the fuck was that? Kitsune tips us off that Jester is associated with the Dark Blade Gang. Word is, they're vampires, so I best come prepared. I purchase a steak and borrowed a strobe light for good measure. We call ahead, since they don't open the Darkblade compound to just anyone. I offer them a magic fetish I picked up on a side quest a while back. Oh, did I not mention the graveyard side quest? That's what I needed the scalpel for from the morgue. I needed it to pick cemetery locks. We arrive at our meeting. The vampire is actually kind of surprised we're willing to give him such a powerful artifact for little more than the name and location of the jester. He provides them, goes on a villain rant, and then scurries off. I have some regrets, actually. Now, look here, we made a deal with this guy, but we made no arrangements for what came after that deal. The vampire clearly possesses weapons of mass destruction, and I bought all this vampire slaying gear, and I'm just not gonna let that go to waste. We sprint through the crypt because I'm not gonna fight that many ghouls. Are you gonna fight that many ghouls? Didn't think so. And I reach the bottom of the lair. The strobe light reduces our vampiric friend to a shambling cartoon character. And when we pull the stake, he begs for his life. Listen, I do appreciate the groveling, but I bought this stake, so I'd like to get my money. Oh, okay, now he's just confessed that he lied about the name of the jester spirit, and now he tells me the real one. Yes, very nice bonus, very glad I came here, but like I was saying, this stake was expensive, and I'd just like to... Okay, yeah, this time we got him. The jester is apparently sheltered on a boat called the Bremerton. So we hit up the docks and charter a smaller vessel to get to it. The Bremerton is a fun section. Probably the best, dungeon kind of enemy-filled area in the game. Jake is finally getting to be a pretty tough fighter. I brought hired Shadowrunners along again, and this time I know enough to keep them alive. This is one bit where the game's pixel artwork trips me up though. There are these invulnerable enemies you have to kill by flipping a series of switches. Took me ages to find those switches. To me, they just look like wall lights. The art is mostly fine in this game, but readability is kind of an issue throughout. It's really tough to make out any fine details whatsoever. At the end of the ship, we find a portal leading to the Jester's little pocket dimension. I blast him a few times, and then when he's ready to listen, I reveal his name. He's dumbstruck that we figured it out, but he's forced to serve us now. According to him, Drake lives in a volcano that can only be accessed via a helicopter on Drake Tower. Jester grumbles, but accepts he's gonna get called in when I need his help against Drake. I check in with Dog. I've been delivering him a bunch of junk throughout the game, and he teaches me spells as thanks. It's the perfect relationship. We've pretty much hit critical mass of Jake's combat skill set. Now it's just a matter of grinding enough XP to get good with all my new spells. Jake Armitage is rapidly becoming a solo god. Hiring Shadowrunners is kind of just a waste of money at this stage onward. We're actually almost done the narrative of this game. Not much more to happen from here. But let me tell you something crazy. That last 10% of the game made up about 60 to 70% of my playtime. Why? Hacking minigames. Fucking hacking minigames. We ascend Drake's tower. Every floor, I get ambushed by tough enemies right at the exit to the elevator. But Jake can just go invisible now. The enemies have no ability to stop us. But there are just so many terminals we have to hack in order to ascend the tower and access the next elevator. The terminals are basically Minesweeper, right? But you're actually walking on the squares? And the game doesn't give you a way to flag the mines. So I just had to chart it out in my notebook. It took about 6 hours of hacking to reach the top of the tower. But then, we're at the volcano complex, and the action begins. The action of descending several more floors full of computers that I have to hack. It's not fair. I'm so good at combat now. Don't make me do more of these puzzles. We just got good at this. After several more hours of hacking, I reach the bottom level. Drake is waiting, and oh, he's an actual dragon! He hits like a truck. We get absolutely shredded anytime he's allowed to attack us unimpeded. Thankfully, Jester stuns him for a bit, and after that, we're able to keep him locked down with the freeze spell. Jake Armitage, Courier, Shadowrunner, Magician, Decker, Street Samurai, and now, Dragon Slayer. How about that? But Drake is not the end. No. He's got a captive scientist down here who finally gives us the picture of why Jake was attacked. Drake is working in partnership with a company called Aneki, which is probably itself a shell corp for one of the biggest Japanese companies. Aneki and Drake were tasked with creating and disseminating an AI capable of seizing control of the entire Matrix. And with it, Aneki's overlords would control global commerce completely. It would be a world takeover. Jake had originally been hired to deliver an AI killer virus into Aneki's mainframe and thwart the plan. Well, I mean, no wonder everyone wants us dead. We've got the cure for world domination rattling around in our skull. We head to Aneki and fight our way to the top. There's a lot more hacking. I don't want to talk about it. But Jake is a bloody tidal wave of combat power at this stage of the game. Absolutely nothing can stop his ascent. In the final room, we see the Aneki mainframe, guarded by the biggest, meanest troll decker on Aneki's payroll. He'd be quite the threat if he could see invisibility. Jake uploads the AI killer, and the entire building begins to self-destruct. We race to the top, gunning down everyone in our way. The helicopter takes off with us in it, just as the tower blows and the internet is saved. Jake Armitage will return in Shadowrun 2. Except, no he doesn't. This game did not get a sequel. Shadowrun for the Genesis is a very different game and a standalone story. It's not a direct sequel. And the third game was... it was much more Japanese. Jake Armitage would eventually be back in Shadowrun Returns in 2013, 20 years after the original. Jake's story continues there, and we will eventually cover it. Shadowrun for the SNES had its ups and downs. I'm pretty confident in saying that it's one of the best executions of RPG mechanics of that time period. Progress was satisfying in ways that few other CRPGs of the era were. It was fun to go from a Jake who legit felt like he had the combat prowess of a mailman to Jake the Shadowrunner who could level city blocks with his cyberware and magic powers. On the other side, the point-and-click adventure game style narrative was, in my opinion, a total miss. You either commit to the game taking 3 months of trial and error to beat, as you say, every single vocab word to every single character between each and every story beat, or you follow a walkthrough, and things feel like a chore in a different direction. The game's also wildly linear, so there's no room for creativity. You must follow the exact course the devs want from you. I'm led to believe that the Genesis game is much less linear, so I'm excited to eventually see if it's an improvement. Because as is, this particular game had great gameplay structure, let down by much less impressive narrative structure. And I say narrative structure. The actual narrative, the actual story was good. I liked the mystery of wondering why the whole world was against Jake. Top notch. Now again, I'd like to continue covering Shadowrun, but the algorithm often works against me when I cover new franchises. If you've enjoyed this, please give the video a like and a comment so we can fight against that YouTube inertia. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll see you all again for spooky season. I reckon we can hunt down something cool to cover this October. Definitely not an obvious hint right there. Alright, see you then.